Have you ever felt that prickling sensation on the back of your neck, the unsettling feeling of being watched, even when you're utterly alone? What if that feeling wasn't just paranoia? What if it was real? Prepare to dive into a world where the mundane turns menacing, where the safety of home becomes a terrifying illusion. This is the story of Sarah, and it begins with a simple click, but spirals into a living nightmare. If you're brave enough, join us, and remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more chilling tales, if you dare. Sarah Miller, 26, found solace in the solitude of her Los Angeles apartment. It was a small space, yes, but hers, filled with the comforting clutter of a life lived quietly, stacks of novels threatening to topple, movie posters adorning the walls like old friends, the soft glow of fairy lights casting a warm, amber hue over everything. She worked from home as a freelance editor, a profession that suited her introspective nature perfectly. Days were filled with the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of her keyboard, punctuated by the occasional sigh of contentment, the rustle of pages turned. Evenings were for diving into the shadowy worlds of detective novels, for losing herself in the suspenseful plots of thrillers, the kind that kept you guessing until the very last page. But beneath this veneer of peaceful routine, there was a faint, almost imperceptible hum of loneliness. Los Angeles, for all its vibrancy, could be a remarkably isolating city. Friends were scattered, family distant. Sarah cherished her independence, but sometimes, in the hushed stillness of her apartment, especially when the city outside throbbed with nocturnal energy, a quiet ache would settle in her chest. She'd push it down, tell herself she was fine, that solitude was a choice, a strength. But the truth, whispered only to herself in the dead of night, was that she longed for connection, for someone to share the quiet moments with, someone to dispel the shadows that sometimes seemed to gather in the corners of her mind. That evening was unremarkable, indistinguishable from 100 others. The Los Angeles sky, perpetually smog-kissed, was painted in shades of bruised purple and ash gray, as Sarah ventured out to the local supermarket. Rain threatened, a rare occurrence in Southern California, casting a damp, heavy feel to the air. She moved through the brightly lit aisles, a solitary figure amongst the hurried shoppers, her mind already drifting back to the novel waiting for her on her bedside table. She picked up her usual staples: almond milk, organic greens, a block of dark chocolate, the small comforts that punctuated her days. Back in her apartment, the rain started, a soft, insistent drumming against the window pane. She unpacked her groceries, the mundane task grounding her, a brief respite from the swirling thoughts in her head. Later, curled on her couch, the storm intensifying outside, she checked her email, a mindless habit before settling into her book. Junk mail, bills, a few newsletters, and then something that made her pause. "Congratulations. You've won." The subject line screamed from the screen. Sarah frowned, her finger hovering over the delete button. Sweepstakes emails were the bane of her online existence. But something about this one made her hesitate. It was from Fresh Foods Market, the very supermarket she'd just visited. The logo was crisp, professional, instantly recognizable. Intrigued, she clicked. The email was well-crafted, polished. It announced she'd been randomly selected as a loyalty reward winner and was entitled to a cash prize. A small amount, just $100, but still a surprise. She reread it, skepticism warring with a flicker of hope. It seemed legitimate. It even referenced her recent visit, mentioning a special promotion running that day. How did they know she'd been there? Loyalty programs, she reasoned. They track everything these days. The email instructed her to click a link to claim her prize. A tiny voice of caution whispered in her mind. Phishing scams. She'd read countless articles, warned by friends. Yet, Fresh Foods Market was a reputable chain. They wouldn't risk their reputation, would they? "It's just $100, she murmured to herself, a justification, a dismissal of her nagging doubts. What's the worst that could happen? Famous last words. With a click that resonated with a chilling finality, Sarah opened the link. A sleek, official-looking web page loaded, mirroring the supermarket's branding. It asked for her name, address, email, phone number, routine information, she told herself. Then came the more sensitive requests, bank account details, for direct deposit of your winnings. A stronger wave of unease washed over her. This felt wrong, but the lure of the prize, however small, and the seeming legitimacy of the source, chipped away at her better judgment. She hesitated again, her cursor hovering over the submit button. She could just close the page, walk away, forget about the $100. But another voice, quieter, more insidious, whispered, "Don't be foolish. It's free money. You deserve a little luck." With a sigh, a surrender to that insidious whisper, Sarah filled in the remaining fields, each keystroke a step further into the darkness. She hit submit, a digital pact sealed with the devil, and a bland confirmation message flashed on the screen. "Thank you for claiming your prize. Your winnings will be deposited within 2 to 3 business days." Relief washed over her, quickly followed by a lingering unease she couldn't quite shake off. She closed her laptop, tried to bury herself in her book, but the words blurred on the page. The storm outside intensified, mimicking the tempest brewing within her. She told herself she was being paranoid, that everything was fine. But deep down, a cold seed of dread had been planted, and it had begun to sprout roots in the fertile ground of her anxieties. Days crawled by, each one amplifying the subtle unease that had taken root. The promised winnings never materialized. Sarah checked her bank account obsessively, refreshing the page, willing the extra $100 to magically appear. Nothing. She tried to dismiss it, tell herself it was just a delayed deposit, that she was overreacting. But the email, the web page, it all seemed so convincing. Had she really been scammed? For $100? It seemed almost too pathetic to be true. Then came the messages. A week after that fateful click, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "We know where you live, Sarah." Her blood ran cold. She stared at the message, heart hammering against her ribs. Who was this? How did they know her name? Her address? Panic clawed at her throat, choking off her breath. She tried to rationalize it away. Wrong number? A prank? But the chilling precision of it, the directness, sent a shiver of genuine terror down her spine. She blocked the number, her hand trembling. But the messages didn't stop. They came from different numbers, each one more cryptic, more unsettling than the last. "Nice apartment. Shame if something happened to it. We see you when you sleep. Don't think you can hide." Sarah started jumping at shadows. Every creak of her building, every passing car, sent jolts of fear through her. She peered through her blinds, scanning the street below, searching for what? A shadowy figure? A menacing van? She didn't know, but the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, became a constant, oppressive weight on her chest. She started noticing things, small, unsettling details that amplified her growing paranoia. A car parked across the street, always the same nondescript sedan, idling for hours. A man in a dark hoodie, lingering near her building entrance, always just out of focus, disappearing when she looked directly at him. Footsteps outside her door at odd hours, light, almost inaudible, but undeniably there. One evening, returning from work, her heart lurched as she noticed something truly disturbing. Outside her apartment door, on the hallway carpet, were faint, muddy footprints. It hadn't rained in days. The footprints were damp, as if made just moments ago. She froze, breath caught in her throat, staring at the telltale marks leading directly to her door, then vanishing. She fumbled for her keys, her hands shaking so violently she could barely grip them. She unlocked the door, practically threw herself inside, slamming it shut and bolting the lock. She leaned against the door, gasping for breath, her eyes darting around her apartment, searching for what? Evidence of intrusion? Someone lurking in the shadows? The apartment was silent, undisturbed. Everything was as she'd left it. But the footprints, they were real. They weren't a figment of her imagination. Someone had been outside her door, recently, watching her. Sleep became a luxury she could barely afford. Every rustle, every creak of her apartment building sent her heart racing. She'd lie in bed, eyes wide open, straining to hear any unusual sound, the silence itself amplifying her terror. Dark circles bloomed under her eyes, her nerves frayed, her mind a tangled knot of fear and paranoia. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that she was no longer safe. Her sanctuary, her apartment, had become a prison, and she was trapped inside with an unseen, unknown predator circling just outside her door. Then came the storm. It descended upon Los Angeles with a vengeance, a furious tempest of wind and rain that lashed against the city, mirroring the storm raging within Sarah's mind. The power flickered, plunging her apartment into momentary darkness, then sputtering back to life, the lights casting eerie, dancing shadows on the walls. Sarah huddled on her couch, wrapped in a thick blanket, trying to lose herself in music, headphones blasting in her ears, a desperate attempt to drown out the storm, to drown out the fear. She was working on a freelance project, editing a manuscript, the words blurring on the screen, her concentration fractured, her thoughts consumed by the gnawing dread that had become her constant companion. The wind howled like a banshee, rattling her windows, the rain hammering against the glass like insistent fists. The lights flickered again, more violently this time, plunging the living room into near darkness, the fairy lights her only source of illumination, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to writhe and twist in the dim light. A deep unease settled in her stomach, a primal fear that transcended logic, a feeling that something terrible was about to happen. Suddenly, a deafening crack echoed through the apartment, followed by a splintering crash. Sarah ripped off her headphones, her heart leaping into her throat. She scrambled off the couch, adrenaline surging through her veins, her eyes darting around the dimly lit room, trying to decipher the source of the terrifying noise. Another crack, louder this time, and then, Ram! The front door exploded inward, splintering wood and shattering the flimsy frame, bursting open with shocking force. The wind howled through the gaping doorway, carrying with it the icy rain and a figure, silhouetted against the storm-racked night, a shape of pure menace filling the frame. Time seemed to distort, stretching and compressing, as Sarah stared, paralyzed by terror, at the figure standing in her doorway. He was tall, hulking, shrouded in black from head to toe, a dark, amorphous shape against the swirling rain and shadows. Gloves encased his hands, obscuring any skin, and a deep hood concealed his face, plunging it into impenetrable darkness. He was a void, a faceless embodiment of fear, and he stood there, motionless for a heartbeat, a silent predator poised to strike. Sarah's mind screamed at her to run, to fight, to do anything but stand there frozen in terror. She finally broke free from the icy grip of shock, scrambling backward, stumbling over the coffee table, desperate to put distance between herself and the looming figure in the doorway. She opened her mouth to scream, but the sound died in her throat, choked by pure, unadulterated fear. He moved then, not rushing, but with a slow, deliberate purpose that was far more terrifying than any frantic lunge. He stepped into the apartment, as if he owned the space, as if he belonged there, his presence instantly eclipsing the familiar comfort of her home, turning it into a space of abject horror. He moved with a sickening familiarity, like a hunter entering his carefully laid trap. Sarah backed away further, her eyes wide with terror, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She tripped over a rug, falling heavily to the floor, the breath knocked from her lungs, a strangled whimper escaping her lips. She scrambled backward again, her fingers scrabbling uselessly against the smooth hardwood floor, trying to gain purchase, to escape, but it was too late. He was upon her in an instant, a dark shape looming over her, blocking out the dim light, casting her in a suffocating shadow. She saw a hand rise, gloved, impersonal, inhuman, and then darkness. Not the gentle darkness of sleep, but a crushing, suffocating void that swallowed her whole, extinguishing consciousness like a snuffed candle. Sarah awoke in darkness, a darkness so thick and heavy, like a damp velvet cloth smothering all her senses. Her head throbbed, a piercing pain like someone hammering nails into her temples. Memories from before surged back, sharp as shards of broken glass, cutting into her mind. The storm, the sound of a door bursting open, a shadowy figure, gloved hands, and then only darkness. She tried to move, but her limbs were numb, heavy as lead. A rough, painful constriction at her wrists and ankles dragged her back to the cruel reality. She was tied up, not with soft ropes, but with something stiff and rough like thorny vines, digging into her skin, cutting off circulation. Panic swelled, a cold wave engulfing all thought. She strained to open her eyes, but darkness still enveloped her, not a glimmer of light. She closed her eyes again, then reopened them, still only murky darkness. She couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything, except the frantic pounding of her heart like drums in her chest, and her own ragged, trembling breaths. A musty odor assaulted her nostrils, a foul, pungent smell like decaying earth and dried blood, mixed with the stench of something decomposing. That putrid smell clung to the air, infiltrating every breath, making her want to gag. A feeling of disgust, revulsion overwhelmed her, swallowing every sense. She tried to orient herself, but the space around her was completely foreign, undefined. No familiar sounds, no familiar light, only encompassing darkness and the overpowering stench. She didn't know where she was, didn't know what had happened, didn't know who her captor was, what they wanted. Only one thing was certain. She was in danger, extreme danger. Gradually, her eyes began to adjust to the darkness. Though still very dim, she started to discern vague shapes around her. She was in a small, cramped room, surrounded by rough, damp stone walls. The only light came from a small crack in the wall, casting pale, weak streaks of light, just enough for her to see dark, stained patches on the floor and cracks crisscrossing the walls like spiderwebs. The room was decaying, desolate, like an abandoned tomb. No windows, only a rickety wooden door, shut tight as if separating her from the outside world. The air was cold, damp, seeping into her skin, making her shiver uncontrollably. She shuddered as she realized the dark patches on the floor weren't dirt. They were blood, dried blood, congealed blood, blood that had soaked deep into the earth, forming gruesome stains. And that overpowering stench, it was probably the smell of death. A faint sound cut through her terrifying thoughts. Footsteps, slow, steady, echoing in the still space. Her heart seemed to stop, holding her breath, listening. The footsteps grew closer, clearer, until she could feel a slight vibration on the ground. The rickety wooden door creaked open, a yellowish light flooding into the room, so blinding that she had to squint. His silhouette appeared in the doorway, still tall, still as dark as night, still concealing all features beneath a hooded cloak and a wide-brimmed hat. He stepped inside, bringing with him the cold air and the characteristic stench of the room. He said nothing, just stood there, looking down at her, terrifyingly silent. The yellowish light cast up at him, just enough for her to see his eyes, two deep black pits in the darkness, staring intently at her, emotionless, without a hint of expression. The silence stretched on, suffocatingly tense. Sarah felt like she was being observed, assessed by a predator, preparing for the final pounce. She tried to swallow, her throat dry, raw. She wanted to speak, to ask, to plead, but her throat was constricted, unable to produce any sound. Finally, he spoke, his voice deep, hoarse, cold as ice, breaking the terrifying silence. "You're awake." That voice echoed in the small room, striking her ears like thunder. No anger, no resentment, just emotionless coldness, even indifference. As if he were talking to an object, not a person. Sarah tried to nod, a small, weak movement. Her eyes remained fixed on him, not daring to look away. She was afraid, terrified to the point of paralysis, terrified to the point of not even feeling physical pain. He approached, slowly, step by step, like a leopard stalking its prey. He squatted down in front of her, the distance between them only a handspan. She could see his eyes more clearly, two deep black pits, bottomless, lightless, like two endless abysses. He raised his hand, slowly, and removed the hood. The yellowish light illuminated his face, and for the first time, Sarah saw the face of her captor. And that face left her speechless, not because it was gruesome, terrifying as she had imagined, but because it was shockingly ordinary. A middle-aged man's face, unremarkable, even somewhat gentle. Only the eyes, still those eyes, cold, emotionless, without a hint of expression. The eyes of a cold-blooded predator. He looked at her, the corner of his mouth twitching into a faint, warmthless smile. That smile was more terrifying than any ferocity. "Do you know how many girls have died here?" he asked, his voice still cold, indifferent, as if asking about the weather, not about the deaths of human beings. That question, and his faint smile, made the blood in Sarah's veins run cold. She felt a shiver run down her spine, an extreme feeling of horror seizing her mind. He didn't wait for her to answer. Standing up, moving towards the corner of the room, he bent down, picked up a half-opened can of beer, tilted his head back, and took a long gulp, the gurgling sound echoing in the still space. Then, he turned back, holding a gas lighter. He flicked the lighter, a tiny flame flaring up in the darkness, casting flickering, ghostly shadows on his face. He raised his hand, bringing the flame close to the wall behind her. And then, the light from that tiny flame illuminated an entire wall covered in images. Old, faded photos, plastered all over the wall, overlapping each other, creating a chaotic, gruesome mass of color. Sarah squinted, trying to make out the images. And when she realized what they were, a choked scream escaped her throat, stifled by utter horror. They were pictures of girls. Young, beautiful, vibrant, and all of them were dead. Their faces pale, soulless, their eyes wide and staring, their bodies contorted, distorted. They were victims. His victims. He stood there, gazing at the wall full of his achievements, his face expressionless, only his eyes gleaming with a morbid, savage light. He turned back to look at Sarah, that faint smile reappearing on his lips. "See, this is my collection. You'll be the next piece," he said, his voice still cold, indifferent, but this time, Sarah recognized a morbid delight hidden in his voice. A delight of a sick man, reveling in his own evil. "I'll sell your organs to special clients. They pay very well. Did you know that?" He continued to speak, telling about his horrific plans, about how he would dissect her body, taking out each internal organ, selling them to a secret organization. He talked about money, about power, about his morbid satisfaction. Sarah listened to him speak, her ears ringing, her mind blank. All hope, all thoughts of resistance seemed to vanish, crushed by utter horror. She felt like an animal trapped in a cage, waiting for the day to be butchered. No escape, no hope, only darkness and death awaiting her ahead. But deep within that seemingly endless despair, a tiny spark still flickered. Survival instinct. Even though everything around her was dark, even though hope was as thin as a hair, Sarah hadn't completely surrendered. She began to observe. not panicking, not weeping, but observing quietly, carefully, like a wounded animal seeking a chance to escape. Her eyes scanned the room, trying to memorize every detail, no matter how small. The wall full of horrifying photos, the rickety wooden door, the blood-stained floor, and then her gaze stopped at a small table placed against the wall, hidden behind the captor. On the table, a few items were scattered messily. A bright red gas lighter standing out against the gray wood, a few shards of broken glass reflecting the weak light, a crumpled, crushed, empty soda can. Things that seemed meaningless, but in this desperate situation, they could be the keys to opening the door to survival. The lighter could create fire. But fire for what? To burn the ropes? Probably not feasible. The ropes seemed too strong, and she wasn't sure she had enough time and dexterity to perform that action without being detected. The shards of glass could cut. Cut the ropes? Sounded more plausible. But were the shards sharp enough? And how could she access them without him suspecting? The soda can an empty can. Useless. Or not. An idea flashed in her mind. A bold, crazy idea, but also full of hope. The soda can thin metal, but if sharpened, it could become a crude saw. Enough to saw through the ropes? Maybe. Enough to saw through window bars? Probably impossible. But who knew? In this situation, any chance, no matter how small, was worth grasping. The decision was made. She had to act. Could not sit here and wait for death. Had to find a way to escape. But how? The captor was still right in front of her. He was talking, laughing, reveling and telling about his crimes. He didn't take his eyes off her, as if afraid she would disappear, afraid the prey would slip away. She had to distract him, had to make him lower his guard. But how? She took a deep breath, trying to keep her voice calm, not trembling. Why are you doing this? She asked, her voice soft, weak, like a frightened lamb before a fierce wolf. It was a stupid, meaningless question, but she needed to say something to attract his attention, to draw him into a conversation, no matter how terrible the conversation was. The captor stopped talking. He turned to look at her, his cold eyes narrowed. Perhaps he was surprised that she dared to speak up, dared to break the terrifying silence. Why, huh? He repeated her question, his tone mocking. You really want to know? Sarah nodded, slightly, her eyes pleading. She knew she was playing a dangerous game, but she had no other choice. She had to stall for time, had to create an opportunity to carry out her plan. He smirked, a faint, cruel smile. All right, I'll tell you. Anyway, you're about to die soon. Knowing a little more about your hero isn't so bad, right? He began to tell his story, his voice deep, hoarse, monotonous, like reading a gruesome fairy tale. He told about his unhappy childhood, about the suffering, the humiliation he had endured. He told about the hatred, the resentment accumulated in his heart, turning him into a demon in human skin. Sarah listened to him tell his story, her ears ringing, her head spinning. She didn't care about his story. She just pretended to listen, trying to maintain the conversation, to buy time. Meanwhile, her eyes still kept observing, looking for an opportunity, looking for the shard of broken glass. But the shard of glass was on the other side of the table, too far out of her reach. How could she get them without him noticing? She suddenly realized the old soda can was right next to her, only a few centimeters away from her hand. A bold idea flashed in her mind. She could use the soda can to conceal her actions. She subtly shifted her body, pretending to be uncomfortable because the ropes were too tight. I'm thirsty, she said, her voice weak, trying to convey pain, fatigue. The captor stopped telling his story. He looked at her, his eyes suspicious. Thirsty? You think you have the right to demand? Please, just a little, Sarah pleaded, her voice urgent. My throat is too dry. He was silent for a moment, as if considering. Then he shrugged, indifferently. All right. Anyway, you'll be dying of thirst soon enough. He stood up, moved towards the table, picked up the old soda can. He was not suspicious at all, not vigilant. He only regarded her as a harmless animal, incapable of resistance. This was her chance. While he reached for the soda can, Sarah subtly leaned over. Her right hand, although tightly bound, could still move a little. She secretly groped around, searching for the shard of broken glass. Her fingers touched something cold, sharp, the shard of glass. Her heart pounded, adrenaline surged. She gripped the shard tightly in her hand, hiding it in her palm. The captor turned back, handing her the soda can. Sarah took it, her hand trembling, but she tried to hide her excitement, anxiety. "Thank you," she said, her voice mumbling, pretending to be weak. She raised the can to her mouth, pretending to drink, but in reality to obscure his view. While he was still watching her, Sarah secretly moved her right hand down, bringing the shard of glass close to the rope at her wrist. She began to saw, slowly, carefully, little by little. The shard of glass wasn't very sharp, but enough to cut into the rope, albeit very slowly. Time passed like eternity. The captor still stood there, watching her drink. He was not suspicious, not paying attention to her secret action. Perhaps he was too confident in his control, too underestimated the ability to resist of a weak girl. The rope began to tear, strand by strand. Her skin stung, throbbing with pain from being cut by the shard of glass, but she didn't care. She only focused on sawing the rope, little by little, little by little. Finally, after a long time, as if a century, the rope at her right wrist was completely severed. She felt her hand as if freed. Blood began to circulate again. The numbness gradually disappeared, but she still couldn't move strongly. The ropes at her left wrist and ankles were still intact. She had to continue, had to completely free herself. She lowered the soda can, pretending to have finished drinking. I need to use the restroom," she said, her voice still weak, but this time, with a bit more determination. The captor frowned, looking annoyed. "Use the restroom? You planning to pull something?" I really need to," Sarah pleaded, her voice urgently. "Please. I can't hold it anymore." He looked at her, still suspicious, but in the end, he shrugged again. "All right, but don't even think about pulling anything. I'll be watching you closely." He stood up, approached, grabbed her arm, pulled her to her feet. Her legs were numb. She almost collapsed. He supported her, but his eyes were still cold, without a trace of pity. He untied her ankles, but still held her arm tightly, pulling her out of the dark room. Sarah walked staggeringly, her legs felt alien. She tried to remain calm, not to reveal any abnormality. She knew this was her chance, her only chance to escape. He dragged Sarah out of the dark room, pulling her along a narrow, damp corridor. The corridor was pitch black, with only a flickering light cast from an oil lamp hanging precariously on the wall, creating ghostly shadows that danced around. The musty and foul odor was even more pungent, mixed with the acrid smell of kerosene. Sarah tried to observe her surroundings, even though her head was still spinning and her legs trembling. She realized she was in a dilapidated, ruined house. Walls were peeling, ceilings were collapsing, the floor was uneven, full of holes and obstacles. The desolate scene was like a bleak painting of decay and oblivion. He dragged her to another wooden door, this door looking even older and more rickety than the door of her prison room. He opened the door and pushed her inside. This was a small room, no less dark than the previous one, but with a faint hint of natural light seeping in from a tiny window, covered in dirt. The dim light was enough for her to recognize it as a dilapidated restroom. A filthy, stained toilet, a cracked sink, a rusty faucet, a cloudy mirror covered in condensation and stains. The space was cramped, suffocating, reeking of ammonia. He pushed Sarah inside, slamming the door shut, but not locking it. He stood right outside, guarding, his heavy breathing echoing through the thin wooden door. Sarah leaned her back against the door, gasping for breath, her heart racing wildly. She knew this was her chance, her only chance, but time was running out. He wouldn't leave her here for too long. She had to act, and act fast. Her eyes darted around the restroom, searching for anything that could help her. The cracked sink, the rusty faucet, the cloudy mirror, and the window. The tiny window, located quite high off the ground, but it was a window, and windows usually have bars. Hope flickered in Sarah's heart. Window bars. If she could cut through the bars, she could escape. But with what? The shard of glass? Too small, too weak. Impossible to cut through iron bars with a shard of glass. Her mind raced furiously, trying to find a solution. The soda can. The metal soda can. If she could sharpen the edge of the soda can, turn it into a saw blade. She looked down at the soda can still in her hand. Hope surged stronger than ever. The soda can, that was the key. But how to sharpen the edge of the soda can? In this dilapidated restroom, was there anything hard enough to sharpen metal? Her eyes darted around again, searching, and then her gaze stopped at the sink. The sink was made of porcelain, cracked and chipped. Porcelain. Porcelain was very hard. She could use the sharp edge of a broken piece of porcelain to sharpen the edge of the soda can. The idea was formed. The escape plan began to take shape in her mind. But to carry out this plan, she needed time and secrecy. She had to stall for time, had to make the captor wait longer. She looked at the cloudy mirror, trying to calm herself. Deep, slow breaths, regaining her composure and determination. She couldn't break down. Not allowed to despair. Must survive. Must escape from this hell. She began to act. First, she had to sharpen the edge of the soda can. She bent down, placed the soda can on the floor, and used both hands to tear hard, tearing the soda can in half lengthwise, turning it into two thin, rectangular pieces of metal. The edge of the soda can was quite sharp, but not sharp enough to saw through iron bars. She needed to sharpen them further. She approached the sink, observing the cracks on the porcelain surface. She searched for a broken piece of porcelain sharp enough and with a sharp edge. Finally, she found a triangular shard of porcelain, its edge quite sharp, which could be used to sharpen metal. She held the shard of porcelain in her hand, carefully, avoiding cutting herself. Then, she began to sharpen the edge of the soda can against the shard of porcelain, slowly, patiently, little by little. The sound of metal rubbing against porcelain screeched, ear splitting in the still space. She sharpened continuously, relentlessly, ignoring the stinging pain in her fingers, ignoring the sweat pouring down her forehead. She knew she didn't have much time. The captor could lose patience at any moment. He could burst into check at any moment. She had to hurry, had to complete the work before being discovered. Time passed heavily, slowly as eternity. The screeching sound of sharpening metal echoed in the dilapidated restroom, like the ticking of a countdown clock, counting down her survival time. Finally, after a persistent effort, the edge of the soda can have been sharpened much more. It was still not a perfect saw blade, but enough to saw through ropes, and perhaps enough to saw through window bars. She tried using the sharp edge of the soda can to cut into the rope at her left wrist. Metal cut into the rope, creating small rustling sounds. The rope began to tear, strand by strand. Effective. This method was effective. Hope surged even stronger in Sarah's heart. She continued to saw the rope at her left wrist, with all her strength and remaining patience. This time, she was more experienced, operating faster, more decisively. Just a moment later, the rope at her left wrist was also severed. Both her hands were free. A feeling of freedom flooded her body, but she didn't dare to rejoice. She was still not safe. There were still window bars, and the captor was still guarding outside. She massaged her wrists to get the blood flowing. The numbness gradually disappeared. Then, she moved on to sawing the ropes at her ankles. This time, she used both hands, operating faster, stronger. Before long, the ropes at her ankles were also severed. She was completely free. She stood up, took a few steps, feeling her legs were back to being hers. But time was running out. She had to act immediately. She approached the window, observing the bars. The bars were quite thick, sturdy, firmly attached to the wall. Sawing through iron bars with a soda can seemed like an impossible task, but she had no other choice. Must try her best, must escape. She began to saw the bars, slowly, carefully, little by little. The sound of metal rubbing against metal screeched, louder, more ear-splitting than the sound of sharpening porcelain. That sound could carry outside, could be heard by the captor. She had to be more careful, had to minimize the noise. She saw it slower, gentler, but still persistent, relentless. She knew each saw stroke was a step closer to freedom. Every moment that passed was a moment she had more hope. But footsteps outside the corridor. Footsteps getting closer, clearer. He was coming back. He was suspicious. He was about to burst in. Panic surged. Sarah stopped sawing, held her breath, her heart as if stopping. She listened, intensely strained. Footsteps stopped right in front of the restroom door. His heavy breathing echoed in. "Are you done yet? It's taking too long." His voice rang out, deep, hoarse, cold, but this time, with a hint of impatience, a hint of suspicion. Sarah swallowed hard, her throat dry. She had to answer, had to distract him, had to stall for time. I'm almost done," she called out, her voice weak, trembling, trying to sound normal. Just a little longer." Silence. Suffocating tension. Sarah held her breath, waiting for his reaction. Would he believe her? Would he leave? Or would he burst into check? A deathly silence descended. Sarah stood motionless, holding her breath, straining her ears to listen. There was no sound, except the pouring rain outside and her heart pounding frantically as if trying to leap out of her chest. Did he believe her? Or was he suspicious, waiting for her to slip up so he could burst in? Cold sweat broke out on her forehead, soaking her bangs. Her hands trembled, clutching the sharp metal piece, ready to continue sawing the bars, but she didn't dare. Any sound, no matter how small, could betray her position, ruin this fragile chance of escape. Time passed slowly, heavily, like eternity. Each passing moment was a terrible mental torture. The silence outside the restroom door made her even more afraid. What did the silence mean? Had he left? Or was he lurking, waiting for her to show herself? Suddenly, footsteps sounded again. This time, not slow, steady footsteps anymore, but hurried, strong, angry footsteps. He didn't believe her. He knew she was up to something. He was about to burst in. Despair surged. Sarah knew she had no more time. The plan to saw through the bars had failed. She had to find another way, had to escape immediately before he burst in and caught her. But escape how? The main door was locked. The window had bars. In this dilapidated restroom, there were no weapons, no escape route. Or was there? Her eyes darted around the restroom again, once more, desperately searching. And this time, her gaze stopped at the filthy toilet. The toilet, made of porcelain. Porcelain was very hard. And toilets usually have a lid. The toilet lid. It was also made of porcelain, and it could be detached. A crazy idea flashed in Sarah's mind. A desperate idea, but also bold. She could detach the toilet lid, use it as a weapon. The porcelain toilet lid, quite heavy, quite hard. If she hit him hard on the head, maybe it would be enough to knock him down, or at least stun him, creating a chance for her to escape. It was her last chance. Her only chance. No more time to hesitate. She had to act immediately. Footsteps outside the corridor were getting closer, clearer. He was coming. Sarah took a deep breath, deciding to bet everything on this crazy idea. She quickly approached the toilet, bent down, and used both hands to grip the porcelain toilet lid firmly. The toilet lid was quite heavy, cold, covered in dirt and stains. She tried to detach the toilet lid, but it was firmly attached to the bowl with screws. No tools, impossible to unscrew. Time was running out. Despair surged again. The last plan had also failed. No hope left. But wait, the toilet lid. No need to detach it. She could use the whole toilet lid, both the lid and the seat, to attack him. The whole heavy porcelain block, if hit hard on the head, would surely cause injury. The final decision was made. No turning back. Must fight. Must survive. She gripped the toilet lid even tighter, put all her strength into her hands, lifting the heavy porcelain block high. Her hands trembled with the weight, but she still tried to hold firm. Her heart pounded frantically, adrenaline surging, preparing for the life or death battle. Footsteps stopped right in front of the restroom door. His heavy breathing breezed in through the door gap. She knew he was about to burst in. This was the decisive moment. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, then opened her eyes, her gaze determined, no longer any fear. She gripped the toilet lid in her hand, standing right behind the door, waiting for him to burst in. The rickety wooden door burst open. He appeared in the doorway, his face showing clear anger, his eyes flashing fiercely. He rushed in, without hesitation, without caution. He was too confident in his strength, too underestimated the ability to resist of a weak prey. That was his fatal mistake. As soon as he stepped through the doorway, Sarah screamed, a scream tearing through the silence, then with all her remaining strength, swung the porcelain toilet lid forcefully, hitting him directly on the head. Thump! A terrifying collision resounded. Bones seemed to shatter. The porcelain toilet lid collided violently with his head, creating a terrible impact. He cried out in horror, the cry choked in his throat, then collapsed like a banana tree being felled. Sarah didn't stop. Adrenaline drove her. Fear and despair transformed into extraordinary strength. She continued to swing the toilet lid, hitting him repeatedly on the head, frantically, mercilessly. Thump, thump, thump. The terrifying collision echoed in the dilapidated restroom, mingled with his painful groans. Fresh blood began to gush from his head, staining the floor red. He tried to raise his hands to defend himself, but in vain. Sarah's successive hammer-like blows prevented him from getting up. Finally, after a series of fierce attacks, he lay motionless on the floor, no longer moving, no longer resisting. Only Sarah's heavy panting echoed in the still space, mixed with the pouring rain outside. Sarah stood panting, her hands still clutching the blood-stained toilet lid. She looked down at the motionless body of her captor, her eyes still panicked, but also gleaming with a faint ray of hope. She had won. She had survived. She had rescued herself. But was it really over? Had the nightmare really passed? Or was it just beginning? A vague sense of unease arose in Sarah's heart. This dilapidated house, perhaps he wasn't alone. There might be his accomplices, hiding somewhere, waiting for her to slip up and appear. She didn't dare to risk it. Had to escape immediately. Had to leave this hell as quickly as possible. She dropped the blood-stained toilet lid onto the floor and shakily stepped out of the restroom. The corridor was still pitch black, deserted, with only the flickering oil lamp casting ghostly shadows. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself, then began to run, running as fast as she could, running in the opposite direction from the restroom, running towards the exit. She didn't know where the exit was, but she had to run, had to search, had to escape this place. She ran along the narrow corridor, tripping, almost falling many times, but she didn't stop. She ran in the darkness, ran in fear, ran in despair, but also ran in hope, a faint hope for a brighter future, hope for survival. Finally, she saw light. A glimmer of light at the end of the corridor, cast from a half-open wooden door. The exit. She had found the exit. Her heart seemed to gain strength again. She accelerated, running even faster towards the wooden door, rushing straight out. Sarah burst through the wooden door and stumbled out into the night. The storm was still raging, the wind howling like a tormented beast, the rain lashing down in sheets, blurring her vision, soaking her to the bone in seconds. She was outside, free, but the freedom was terrifying, disorienting. She found herself in the heart of a dense, sprawling forest. Towering trees clawed at the sky, their branches twisting and writhing like skeletal arms in the storm-tossed wind. The ground beneath her feet was uneven, treacherous, littered with fallen branches, slick with mud and rain. Darkness pressed in from all sides, broken only by the flashes of lightning that illuminated the scene in stark, fleeting bursts, painting the forest in eerie, otherworldly shades of silver and black. She was lost, utterly, terrifyingly lost. She had no idea where she was, no sense of direction, no plan, just the instinct to run, to escape, to put as much distance as possible between herself and that house of horrors. She started running, blindly, frantically, crashing through the undergrowth, branches whipping at her face, thorns tearing at her skin. She stumbled, fell, scrambled back to her feet, driven by a primal fear that propelled her forward, adrenaline coursing through her veins, masking the pain, the exhaustion, the cold. The rain stung her eyes, blurring her vision further. Mud caked her shoes, making each step heavier, more arduous. She was gasping for breath, her lungs burning, her heart hammering against her ribs like a frantic drumbeat. But she couldn't stop, couldn't slow down. Not yet. Not until she was sure she was safe. If such a thing was even possible anymore. Every shadow seemed to writhe and twist, taking on menacing shapes. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sounded like footsteps, like pursuit. Paranoia gnawed at her, whispering insidious doubts in her ear. Was she truly alone? Or was he, or they, out there, hunting her in the storm-lashed darkness? She dared not look back, dared not slow down to check, just kept running, fueled by fear and a desperate, fragile hope. She had to believe she could escape, had to believe there was still a chance for survival. She ran for what felt like hours, her body screaming in protest, her mind teetering on the brink of exhaustion. The forest seemed to stretch on endlessly, a labyrinth of shadows and rain, a nightmarish landscape mirroring the horror she had just escaped. Suddenly, her foot caught on a root hidden beneath the mud and leaves. She cried out, lost her balance, and went sprawling, crashing heavily to the ground. Pain shot up her leg, sharp, searing, stealing her breath. She lay there for a moment, winded, disoriented, the rain pelting her face, mud seeping into her clothes. She tried to get up, but her ankle twisted beneath her, sending another wave of agony through her leg. She gasped, collapsing back onto the ground, a sob escaping her lips. She was injured, alone, lost in the storm-ravaged wilderness. Hope began to dwindle, replaced by a chilling sense of despair. But then, through the driving rain, through the howling wind, she heard it. A sound, faint, distant, but undeniably there. A sound that pierced through the storm's fury and resonated with a promise of civilization, of help, of rescue. The sound of a car engine. Hope surged back, stronger this time, a lifeline in the drowning sea of her despair. She struggled to her feet, ignoring the searing pain in her ankle, and started limping towards the sound, her heart pounding with renewed determination. She pushed through the trees, stumbling, falling, getting back up, driven by the distant rumble of the engine, a beacon in the darkness. The sound grew louder, closer, and then, through a break in the trees, she saw it. Lights, bright, welcoming lights, cutting through the darkness, illuminating a narrow dirt road that snaked through the forest. A car was approaching, headlights cutting swaths through the rain-swept night. Relief washed over her, so intense it almost buckled her knees. She had made it. She was going to be okay. She stumbled out of the trees, onto the road, waving her arms frantically, shouting, her voice lost in the wind and rain. The car slowed, then stopped, headlights blinding her momentarily. A window rolled down, and a face appeared, framed by the dim interior light. A woman's face, etched with concern, peering out at her through the rain-streaked glass. "Are you all right? What happened?" The woman's voice was kind, laced with worry. Sarah could barely speak, her voice hoarse, choked with emotion. "Help, please, help me," she gasped, tears streaming down her face, mingling with the rain. He kidnapped me. I escaped." The woman's eyes widened in shock. She didn't hesitate. She threw open the car door. "Get in. Quickly." Sarah didn't need to be told twice. She stumbled towards the car, collapsing into the passenger seat, the warmth of the interior a stark contrast to the cold, brutal wilderness she had just escaped. The woman slammed the door shut, locking out the storm, locking out the darkness, at least for now. As the car sped away, leaving the forest behind, Sarah leaned back against the seat, closed her eyes, and finally allowed herself to breathe. She was safe. For now. But the horrors she had endured, the darkness she had faced, they would forever be etched into her soul. The nightmare was over, but the scars, they would remain. And somewhere, deep down, a chilling voice whispered, was it really over? Or was this just the beginning of a new kind of terror? After escaping the clutches of her tormentor and finding temporary safety with the kind stranger, Sarah was brought back to the relative normalcy of her Los Angeles apartment. The police were called. Detectives arrived, their presence feeling both reassuring and invasive, disrupting the fragile peace of her sanctuary. They were professional, efficient, asking questions, taking notes, examining the remnants of her shattered front door, the muddy footprints she'd unknowingly tracked in. Returning to her apartment, however, felt profoundly wrong. It was no longer hers. It was tainted, violated. The familiar comfort was gone, replaced by a chilling emptiness, a psychic residue of terror that clung to the walls, the furniture, the very air she breathed. Every shadow seemed deeper, every sound amplified, every creak of the building sending jolts of anxiety through her. The sanctuary had become a haunted space, a constant reminder of her near-death experience. The police investigation was unsettling. They went to the house in the woods Sarah described, the house of horrors. They found it exactly as she had described. The room, the bloodstains, the gruesome wall of photographs. It was all real, horrifyingly real. But they found no body, no sign of the man who had kidnapped her. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. They searched the surrounding woods, meticulously combed the house, but found nothing, no trace of him, as if he were a ghost. The only tangible evidence they recovered were the photographs. Dozens of them, Polaroids, faded and yellowed with age, each depicting a young woman, posed against the same decaying wall in the same gruesome room. Each woman was different, yet eerily the same, young, vulnerable, their faces frozen in expressions of terror or resignation, each a silent testament to unspeakable horrors. Sarah looked at them, each face a ghost of a life stolen, and felt a cold dread seep into her bones. These were the girls he had spoken of, the girls who had died there, and she had almost become one of them. The police recognized some of the faces. Missing persons cases, cold cases, unsolved disappearances stretching back years. The photographs were a breakthrough, a horrifying confirmation of their worst fears. But without a body, without the perpetrator, it was still just a collection of gruesome images, a chilling tableau of unsolved crimes. The detectives interviewed Sarah again and again, patiently, respectfully, yet each question, each recounting of her ordeal, chipped away at her fragile composure, forcing her to relive the terror, to confront the darkness she so desperately wanted to escape. They asked about the man, his appearance, his voice, any detail she could remember. She described him as best she could, the black clothing, the gloves, the hooded face, the chillingly ordinary features, the cold, dead eyes. But it was also vague, so indistinct, like trying to grasp smoke. They showed her mugshots, databases of known offenders, hoping for a match, a flicker of recognition. Nothing. He was a ghost, a phantom, existing only in the shadows, leaving no trace, no fingerprints, no digital footprint. It was as if he had materialized from the darkness itself, committed his atrocities, and then dissolved back into the void. Days turned into nights, each one blurring into the next. Sarah was physically safe, back in her apartment, under police protection, yet she felt more vulnerable than ever. Sleep was a battlefield of nightmares, filled with shadowy figures, exploding doors, cold, dead eyes staring at her from the darkness. She'd wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, heart pounding, the echoes of terror lingering long after the dream faded. She tried to resume her routine, to work, to read, to find some semblance of normalcy in her shattered life. But everything felt wrong. The tap-tap-tap of her keyboard sounded hollow, meaningless. The words on the pages of her novels blurred into meaningless streaks of ink. The quiet solitude of her apartment, once a source of comfort, now felt oppressive, suffocating. Every silence was filled with unspoken threats, every shadow concealing unseen eyes. One evening, exhausted, emotionally drained, Sarah decided to try and sleep. She locked her doors, double-checked the windows, even barricaded the front door with a heavy chair, a pathetic attempt to reinforce her fragile sense of security. She swallowed a sleeping pill, hoping for oblivion, for a few hours of respite from the relentless torment of her thoughts. She drifted off to sleep, fitfully, Uneasily, the darkness pressing in around her, filled with whispers and shadows. And then she woke up. Not with a start, not from a nightmare, but just woke up. The room was dark, silent. Too silent. A prickling sensation on the back of her neck, the familiar feeling of being watched, prickled her skin. She lay in bed, eyes wide open, straining to hear, to sense, to understand what had disturbed her sleep. And then she smelled it. Faint, almost imperceptible, but undeniably there. The scent of coffee. Freshly brewed coffee. Rich, dark, aromatic, wafting from somewhere in her apartment. Coffee? She hadn't made coffee. She hadn't even set the coffee maker to brew automatically. She hadn't had coffee since before. Before the supermarket, before the email, before the nightmare began. A cold dread washed over her, colder, more terrifying than anything she had felt before. This wasn't a nightmare. This was real. Someone was in her apartment. Again. She lay frozen in bed, heart hammering, every muscle tense, listening, straining to hear any sound, any indication of who or what was in her apartment. Silence. Only the faint, insidious aroma of coffee, growing stronger, more pervasive, filling the darkness with its unnerving presence. Slowly, cautiously, she reached for the lamp on her bedside table, her hand trembling so violently she could barely grasp the switch. She flicked it on. Weak light flooded the room, chasing away some of the darkness, but not the terror. She sat up in bed, her eyes darting around the room, searching, scanning, her breath caught in her throat. The bedroom was empty, undisturbed. Everything seemed normal, except for the scent of coffee and the chilling certainty that she was not alone. With agonizing slowness, she swung her legs out of bed, her feet touching the cold floor. She stood up, hesitantly, every nerve ending screaming at her to stay put, to hide, to disappear. But she couldn't stay in bed, paralyzed by fear. She had to know, had to confront whatever or whoever was in her apartment. She crept towards the bedroom door, her heart pounding in her chest, each step deliberate, silent. She reached the door, paused, took a deep breath, and then, slowly, cautiously, opened it. The hallway was dark, silent, the only light filtering in from the living room, casting long, distorted shadows that danced and writhed on the walls. The scent of coffee was stronger here, leading her, beckoning her into the darkness. She moved down the hallway, step by agonizing step, towards the living room, her senses on high alert, every muscle coiled tight, ready to flee, to fight, to do whatever it took to survive. She reached the living room doorway, paused again, peering cautiously around the corner. And then she saw it. On the coffee table, in the center of the living room, a single white ceramic mug sat steaming gently, filled to the brim with dark, rich coffee. The aroma filled the room, heavy, cloying, sickeningly familiar. And then a voice she knew, a voice that chilled her to the very core of her being, a voice that whispered from the shadows behind her, close, intimate, terrifyingly familiar. "Good morning, Sarah." Sarah froze, every muscle in her body locking up, her blood turning to ice. She didn't dare turn around, didn't dare breathe, didn't dare move. She knew that voice. She knew who it was. The man from the house in the woods. He was here, in her apartment. Again. "Did you sleep well?" The voice continued, closer now, right behind her, a chilling whisper in the darkness. "I made you coffee, just the way you like it." Sarah stood there, paralyzed by terror, the scent of coffee filling her nostrils, the sound of his voice echoing in her ears, the darkness pressing in around her, suffocating, consuming. The nightmare, it wasn't over. It had just begun. Again, this story explores the deep-seated fear of vulnerability and the chilling realization that safety can be an illusion. It plays on the psychological horror of being hunted, not just physically, but mentally, with the protagonist's sense of security and reality being slowly eroded. The ending leaves the audience with a haunting sense of unease, suggesting that some nightmares may never truly end. If you enjoyed this chilling tale, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Let me know what scared you the most and what keeps you up at night. And if you're brave enough for more terrifying stories, stay tuned, because the darkness is always waiting.